When I was a little boy, no more than 2, my cat saved my life. His name was Willie. He was a large, handsome tabby with a little white dot right on the end of his nose. I barely remember him, and I don't remember the events at all as I was so young, but my parents have told me the story ad nauseum. From what they've told me, we were all in the kitchen. My mom was cooking dinner, and my dad was just hanging out at the kitchen table, being his usual goofy, fun self. Willie was perched in the large bay window, watching the birds that had recently returned for spring. We had a basement door that opened off of the kitchen and didn't close properly. Normally, my parents would try to keep it closed, but since we were all together, I guess they just didn't think it was a big deal. Well, as it goes with small children, the moment they weren't looking, I bolted for the basement door. My mom was the closest, but her back was turned as she cooked. My dad was next, but he was seated at the kitchen table. By the time he got up off the seat, I was already at the door. Farthest away was Willie, from my dad's account, as he was jumping from his chair. He saw the cat fly past his ankles in a furry little blur, sprint to the basement door ahead of me, and jump up on my chest, knocking me back gently on my rear end. I know this may not seem like much. A fall down the stairs would have hurt, but hardly have killed a springy little toddler like myself. But a few months later, during a routine checkup, my doctor discovered an abnormality in one of the discs in my neck. It was pressing against my spinal cord to an alarming degree. They said it was most likely congenital and would require immediate surgery, as any little fall I took would likely result in death. Willie had always been a cherished member of the family, but to say that our love for him grew after these events would be an understatement. We treated him like the little hero he was. We showered that animal with all the love we had until, when I was 9 or 10, he died. We put his ashes on the mantle next to our favorite picture of him, as well as his old collar and tags. It's still there, in my parents' home to this day. Now, of course, I was heartbroken when this happened, but being young and resilient, I soon bounced back. We had more cats and a dog. I grew up, went to high school, had girlfriends, went off to college, started my career and moved out of my parents' home. In short, I grew up. I had mostly forgotten about Willie, but his memory was always there with me somewhere, deep inside my subconscious mind. One day, in my late 20s, having recently signed the lease on an apartment that allowed pets, I decided it was time to get my own cat. I went down to the local shelter and looked around. None of the animals they had seemed to be what I was looking for. There seemed to be no real connection with any of them. I wish I could explain it better, but I can't. I just didn't feel anything until I came up to this cage in the far corner of the shelter, set down low, almost at foot level. And inside was a large, handsome tabby with a little white dot right on the end of his nose. I don't remember if the similarity hit me overtly or just subconsciously, but I felt immediately drawn to the animal. I put my fingers through the thin metal bars at the front of the cage and clicked my tongue. Right away, he came forward and began rubbing his face against my fingers, purring loudly. I filled out the paperwork and adopted him on the spot. I named him Gus after the Gus Fring character on Breaking Bad. He settled in wonderfully, almost too easily. It was as if we were old friends that had known each other forever, but just hadn't seen each other in years. So much about him seemed familiar. The way he seemed to prefer cuddling up right next to me instead of sitting on my lap, and even the way he liked having his paws rubbed. Most cats I'd known would take your hand off for simply touching the paws. It was eerie, to be honest. I began to think back to Willie, my sweet old friend. How close we had been, how much I'd loved him, and how he had saved my life when nobody else could. I'm not sure what I believed or what I believe to this day, but it felt like having him back. My parents even commented on the similarities when they visited. A few months after getting him, my girlfriend of 5 years, my first love, phoned me to say she was leaving me for someone else. Up until this point in my life, this was the most emotional pain I had ever felt. I had loved her with all my heart and thought we would be together forever. Looking back, I was naive and inexperienced. I honestly should have seen this coming, but it completely blindsided me. I was wrecked. Already emotional person that suffered from mild mental illness, I fell into a deep depression. And I hardly left my bed, and I hardly ate. I lost weight, lost touch with my friends, and missed way too much work. Eventually, I was let go from my job for it. I was officially at the lowest point I had ever been in my life. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix things. I didn't think that I could. I struggled to find any meaning in life or any point in moving on. Then, late one dark and moonless night, I decided the best thing to do was to just end it. I sat alone at the end of my bed, loosely clutching the revolver I kept the past few years. I tried to think of any reason to go on, and I just couldn't. There was nothing left for me in this life. I put the barrel under my chin and took a deep breath. I felt a tug at my sleeve. I looked down, and there was Gus with his paw on my arm. He let out a little coo and looked up at me. I looked back at the little creature, not knowing what to do. Then he rose up on his hind legs, wrapped his paws around my arm, and began to rub his head against my shoulder while purring loudly. Memories that were lost to that day came pouring back like a dam letting loose. Willie used to do this exact thing. Exactly. All those years ago, he would hug my arm with his little forepaws and bury his head in my shoulder like I was the only thing on earth that mattered to him. I remembered how, as a little boy, how much I loved this, how much I cherished it. I realized that ever since, I had never had another cat that did the same. I dropped the gun on the bed and fell back in utter shock. I could barely breathe. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. I stared at the cat, and it just stared back at me as if it were the most natural thing on earth. I remembered those eyes, the hordes of love and simple animal wisdom stored up in them. I remembered them not only from when I was a child, but somehow from before that, from beyond that. I can't explain it, but the feeling was crystal clear. He had been with me for more than my natural life, was with me somehow beyond the bounds of corporeal existence. Again, I don't know how to explain it, but I knew it deep within. The feeling has since faded somewhat, but it was very real in that moment, and I still recall it to this day. Slowly coming back to myself, I put the gun away and lay down and sobbed myself to sleep. Gus stayed in the bed the entire night, silently watching over me. The next morning, I checked myself into a hospital, but not before dropping Gus off with my parents. I spent about a week in the hospital and another 2 at an outpatient rehabilitation facility until I felt well enough to go back to normal life. It wasn't an easy transition. I was able to get my job back after a lot of paperwork, as well as some really awkward conversations, and my parents paid my rent for a few months while I got back on my feet. Slowly, though, things go back to normal. I got over the bout of depression that nearly killed me. There are still lingering symptoms years later, but I have learned to deal with them far more effectively. The best part was when my parents finally brought Gus back to stay with me. I had missed him terribly. I gave him a special dinner of tuna fish that night, attempting to thank him, however inadequately, for what he had done for me. He spent that night, and every night after, sleeping in the space next to my pillow on my bed, watching silently over me. He lived another 5 years afterward. It was only recently that I had to say goodbye. Like Willie, his ashes sit in my home next to my favorite picture of him and his old collar and tags. Now, however, I make sure to remember him every day. I make sure to thank that little soul every night before I sleep. I wouldn't be here without him, and soon I'll decide to get another cat. It'll be hard, but it's a necessity. A home isn't a home without one, you know? I've already been out to the shelters a few times to look around, to get used to the idea. While there, I carefully and solemnly check each and every cage, each and every room for a certain cat. I look for a large, handsome tabby with a little white dot right on the end of his nose. Part of me knows he is out there somewhere, and always will be, watching over me in the night.